Was the Last Supper a Passover meal? Was the meal in which Yeshua was betrayed by Judas, the one in which he took the wine and the bread and blessed them, etc., was that a Pesach Seder? I will argue in this video that yes, the Pascha that Yeshua celebrated the night he was betrayed was indeed what we call a Passover Seder. And I'm going to go through all the verses, particularly from the Gospel of John, but also some other passages of Scripture from Tanakh, from other Gospel accounts, from the book of Acts, and also from Josephus. And I want to lay a case out for you, which I am fully confident points to only one thing, that yes, it was a Passover meal, the Pascha. Let's take a look. Shalom, welcome to Rob on the Rock. I'm Rob Van Hoff, and I want to make a video to help those that are struggling to understand the Synoptic Gospels, that is Matthew, Mark, and Luke, over against John, with the popular conception and translational support for that conception that the chronologies of the Passover are different. And one of the core questions for disciples of Yeshua is the Last Supper a Passover Seder? Is the Passover what Yeshua is eating with his disciples? And there are people who say, no, it isn't. And there are people who say, yes, it is. And so I wanted to take some time and go through several passages of Scripture, but also look at some stuff outside of Scripture, particularly Josephus, to help take some soundings from the first century and before about the use of what's the Aramaic word pасχα, in all these cases, which is transliterated into Greek, Pascha, often translated as Passover. But we have to remember that we have an Aramaic Jewish culture that uses the word Pascha at this time. Even though the proper Hebrew term we know from the Scripture is Pesach, we know that there was such a broad Aramaic-speaking Jewish culture that used the Aramaic word Pascha. It still says Pesach. It's spelled the same. It just has an aleph at the end. Pascha means the Pesach in Aramaic. But there's no Greek word Passover. So that's one thing you need to remember when you're reading in your English translations. There's no Greek word Passover. It's always an Aramaic word spelled in Greek letters, Pascha. And in our day, we're used to thinking of Passover very, very narrowly, like it's the 14th at evening. It's the lamb that you eat. What I want to show you is that the word had a lot more flexibility, and it was used very much more loosely 2,000 years ago and even before. Yes, it's true that the Pesach lamb is, in fact, to be slaughtered on the 14th of Nisan, at Bein Arbaim, it says, between the evenings. And that is a precise technical term, Pesach. But what we're going to see is that the word Pascha, the Aramaic word Pascha, was used for that lamb. It was used for the meal, but it was also used for the whole 7-day festival, not 7-week. But let's start. We'll go all the way back to Exodus, and I have all these scriptures here for us to look at. So the first one here is Exodus 12, 14 through 18. Of course, I'm sure you know the whole passage here, but this is from the NASB, New American Standard, from 1995. I've modified it a little bit. I've just changed Passover to Pesach or Pascha, and I've changed the Tetragrammaton, L-O-R-D, in caps to Adonai. Now, this day will be a zikaron, it says, a memorial to you. This day, it's talking about Passover. And you shall celebrate it as a feast to Adonai, a chag, it says. Throughout your generations, you are to celebrate it as a permanent ordinance. So it's celebrate it this day. So it's talking about this one day. But then it says, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. So the it includes this whole week. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats anything leavened from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day you shall have a holy assembly, and another holy assembly on the seventh day. No work at all shall be done on them, except what must be eaten by every person. That alone may be prepared by you. You shall also observe Chag HaMatzot, Feast of Unleavened Bread, for on this very day I brought your hosts out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a permanent ordinance. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. So here we see that Chag HaMatzot, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread, is seen as an entirety, as a whole. And the Passover meal is described here as being the first of the 7. So let's continue on here. Let's look at Ezekiel. Everywhere else in the Torah, by the way, it says Chag HaMatzot, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Always the Feast of Unleavened Bread, not the Feast of Pesach. But we do know that in Exodus 12, if you go back to a little bit before and even after where I read today, you'll see it's a Chag LaDonai, that the Passover is called a feast unto the Lord. So we have this general, multi-layered stack of information that is all to be taken together. And Passover is sometimes used to talk about the whole, just as unleavened bread is sometimes used to talk about the whole. And even though it's understood that this is shorthand and that when you zoom in, of course, there's precise detail, things to be differentiated. Let's look at Ezekiel 45, 21 through 24. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, you shall have the Pesach, a feast of 7 days. Unleavened bread shall be eaten. On that day, the prince shall provide for himself and all the people of the land a bull for a sin offering. During the 7 days of the feast, he shall provide as a burnt offering to Adonai 7 bulls and 7 rams without blemish on every day for the 7 days, and a male goat daily for a sin offering. He shall provide as a grain offering an ephah with a bull, an ephah with a ram, and a hin of oil with an ephah. So here we have this image of 7-day feast, but it's under the heading, the Pesach. You shall have the Pesach, a feast of 7 days. And of course, we know that the priests are to eat the sin offerings. So these daily sin offerings of the goat, this is an ongoing commandment for the priest to eat. And this is going to come back when we see John and the idea of the priests not being able to go into the praetorium so that they might eat the Pascha. The priests have an obligation here to eat these sin offerings throughout the whole feast. Okay, we're going to go now to the Apostolic Writings. Matthew 26, 17 through 19. Now on the first day of unleavened bread. Now, the word on is not here. It's just regarding or concerning the first day of unleavened bread, or for the first day of unleavened bread. The disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Pascha?" To eat the Pascha. Here, we know we must be talking about the Passover lamb. And he said, "Go into the city. Well, the city, it's not just any city. We know, we have the cultural knowledge, right? We're not going to argue this is anywhere but Jerusalem. To a certain man, say to him, the teacher says, my time is near. I am to keep the Pascha at your house with my disciples." So here, keeping the Pascha has to do with the larger commandment, not just to eat the lamb. To keep the Pascha includes to eat unleavened bread and bitter herbs. That's part of it. But here, keeping the Pascha is a slight shift from eating the Pascha. The disciples did as Yeshua had directed them. They prepared the Pascha. So prepared the Pascha, wow, that's packed with a lot of things. That means they had to select a lamb, and there was 12 of them to eat one lamb. They had to go have it slaughtered. They had to bring the meat back. They had to procure unleavened bread, bitter herbs, etc. The preparing the Pascha, for any of you who've ever hosted a big meal, let alone a Passover Seder, you know there's a lot of preparation to go into this. So I just share Matthew 26 to say, here, this is one of the clearest places we see that Yeshua is indeed eating the Pascha. His intent is to eat the Pascha, which his disciples prepared at his command. Mark 14:12. On the first day of unleavened bread, when the Pascha was being sacrificed. So now we know the Pascha being sacrificed here is the actual lamb. It's not the unleavened bread. It's not the bitter herb. The Pascha is the lamb actually and it's not just one, right? The Pascha being sacrificed, even though it's just a singular noun, it's all with the lambs that are being slaughtered is referred to as the Pascha. Now, you might say on the first day of unleavened bread, well, that doesn't really start till the 15th, the first day of unleavened bread. And that's true because it's the 14th of Nisan in the afternoon when the Pesach lambs are starting to be sacrificed. Remember, they had to have a pretty efficient assembly line to get this commandment fulfilled because the priests are doing the slaughtering. And so I take Mark 14:12 just to be another, saying the first day of unleavened bread is thinking about the coming feast as a whole, and that for the first day of unleavened bread. In other words, Mark is not saying on the 15th of Nisan. That wouldn't make sense. If Mark was saying it's the 15th of Nisan when the Pascha was being sacrificed, that doesn't make sense. It must mean for the first day of unleavened bread. That is in anticipation of. Because where do you want us to go and prepare for you to eat the Pascha? This is the 14th of Nisan. Let's continue on to look at the Gospels. Luke 2:41 through 43. Now his parents, that's Yeshua's parents, went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Pascha. The feast of the Pascha. Now remember, Chag HaMatzot is the way it's described in the Torah, but unleavened bread and Pascha sometimes refer to the whole. We're going to see this here and even in an outside source, Josephus, who's basically the only Jewish historian outside of the scriptures that we have a lot of material preserved from. He said, every year at the feast of the Pascha. And when he became 12, they went up there according to the custom of the feast. And as they were returning, after spending the full number of days, the boy Yeshua stayed behind in Jerusalem. So here in Luke 2, we see going up to Jerusalem every year at Chag HaPesach, or in Aramaic, the Pascha, the feast of the Pascha. And after spending the full number of days, according to the custom of the feast. So it's called Pascha, and it's understood to extend over a number of days. So this would be familiar, I think, maybe in American culture in the last 100 years, the idea of the days of Christmas, right? All the days of Christmas. You know, Christmas is here, people will say, even though they start playing Christmas music sometimes like in November, and you're like, what? So the idea of a season, it's Christmas season. These are the days of Christmas. There's a famous song, the 12 Days of Christmas. Okay, well, the idea is Christmas is literally one day, right? But then you have this concept of Christmas is in the air. It's the 12 days of Christmas or whatever. We have to allow that kind of cultural reality to help us be informed about first century thought concerning Pesach or the Pascha. It's a season. If you drill down on any one person who's in the idea that, the days of unleavened bread are here. The Pesach is here. And you ask them specifically, I'm sure most Jews at the time would be able to say, well, actually, technically the Passover lamb is on the 14th at evening. And it's technically the unleavened bread for 7 days, etc. And they would be able to break that down for you. But when it comes to just communication between humans, they say Passover's here or Chag HaMatzot is here. And it's the idea of the experientially in the realm of belief and orientation of all your priorities of your life around this coming time, this coming season, this moed, right? This time appointed. That's how we are to understand this. Let's continue. Luke 22. Now the feast of unleavened bread, which is called the Pascha, was approaching. The feast of unleavened bread, so Chag HaMatzot, which is called the Pascha, was approaching. So now Luke 22 fits right back with Luke 2, where he says they went up every year to Jerusalem for the feast of the Pascha. And they spent the full number of days in Jerusalem. Well, here Luke is just using fluidity of language and variability of phrasing to communicate the same thing. Now the feast of unleavened bread. He doesn't say the feast of Pascha like he did in chapter 2. Here he says the feast of unleavened bread, and then he says, which is called the Pascha. That is, the whole feast is called the Pascha. Do you see how there is variability in how the word Pascha is used? It's not tied down on one tiny point. It has this flexibility to talk about everything during the season. Let's look at the Gospel of John now, because John is where people get a little bit upset or confused, because it seems like John's got on a different chronology, that Yeshua is not eating the Passover. It's something different. So we need to look at some of those verses that cause people to stumble. One is in John 13:1. It says, now, before the feast of the Pascha. So look at this. He uses the same phrase that Luke does. If we go back to Luke 2, the feast of the Pascha. But Luke also calls it the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is called the Pascha. So we can bring all that knowledge to John 13:1. Now we do see the word before. This is pro in Greek, which means before the Feast of the Pascha. Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, that he would depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Okay, this is an important verse. But people tend to think, oh, this is not yet, that when it says during supper in the next verse, they think, oh, the Passover is still a long way off. That's not the right way to understand this, friends. In 13 verse 1 is a narrative setting. It's a narrative frame. It's saying that before this final meal, Yeshua had already loved them to the end. It's a narrative context that Yeshua had completely shown his love to his disciples. That's knowing that his hour had come. So it is a way of wrapping up a whole bunch of information, almost like a montage, in just one verse. And then it takes us, because it expects that the readers understand this now is a Passover dinner. During supper, it could be say, and when dinner had come, and when the meal had come, when the Deipnon had come, that is the Passover dinner. John doesn't tell us that. He doesn't have to. The devil having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot to betray him. So it's assuming that we already know so much. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand and that he had come forth from God and was going back to God. So all these things are really long sentences that are incomplete clauses. They're dependent clauses on the main verb. The main verb in verse 1 is he loved them to the end. Everything else is a conditional or a dependent clause, not conditional, pardon me. a dependent clause. They're not complete sentences. He loved them is the main indicative verb. He loved them to the end. That's the point. It was before the Passover had arrived. He had loved them to the end, and that's a monument now. And then it transitions and moves forward to the actual meal. And then again, we have a bunch of incomplete sentences. They're dependent clauses. And it was during the supper. And the devil, having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given, etc., and that he had come forth, etc. None of this is the main sentence. These are subordinate clauses. The main verb, he got up from supper. Then he set aside his garments, and he girded himself. Those are the main verbs. Let's go now. So it's a Passover dinner. It's implied, it's assumed by John that the readers already understand this. John's not trying to give an alternative chronology. He assumes that people already understand that the Last Supper is in fact a Pesach meal, and he's leveraging that to tell more about Yeshua. So let's look at John 18:28. This is a passage that sometimes gives people grief. Then they led Yeshua from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early. And they themselves did not enter into the praetorium so that they would not be defiled, but might eat the Pascha. So here, people say this is a gotcha verse. This is a gotcha verse. Why? Because obviously these priests need to eat the Pascha, and the Pascha hasn't happened yet. So therefore, it must not be Passover yet. So therefore, whatever Jesus ate, whatever dinner he had with his disciples could not have been the Passover. But that's not the way we want to understand this. The Pascha here, that they might eat the Pascha, has to do with the obligation that the priests have to eat for 7 days. They have to eat the commanded sin offerings. That is a commandment in the Torah. And if they're defiled, they would be excluded from that. That's how we are to understand this. That it's referring to the obligatory food for the priests, of course, as long as they maintain their purity, for 7 days. So if this would have been the first day of unleavened bread, or the second, third, fourth, or even the last day of unleavened bread, these priests would still not enter the praetorium. Because any priest over those 7 days who would defile themselves according to whatever their halakha was that they were going by, they would socially have ostracized that person. Say, okay, let's say there are a few priests there and one of them steps into the praetorium, the others would say, okay, you are now unclean and you have to go do whatever purification rites you have to that are required before you can participate in any more of the obligatory offerings. That is what's going on here. It's not talking about the Passover lamb on the 14th of Nisan. Let's look again. John 19:14. Now it was the day of preparation for the Pascha. It was the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." That's what Pilate says. So here's another gotcha verse. Well, it says it was the day of preparation for the Pascha. Well, there you go. That seals the deal. Whatever meal Jesus had with his disciples couldn't have been a Passover, because here we go. It hasn't even happened yet. Well, back again. We have to go back to the Greek. There is no for here. There's no for. It's tu pascha. It is the genitive and the preparation. There's only one use for this word called the preparation day, and that is the day is for Friday. It's always Friday. This word, if you do the Greek search, it's always the day before the weekly Shabbat. It's called the preparation of the weekly Shabbat. So what this means is it's the preparation of the Pascha, not for the Pascha. It's the preparation of the week of Passover. That means it's the Friday within Passover. We know this because John later, we know from all accounts, John and the Synoptics, that Yeshua was crucified on a Friday. That's why it's called Good Friday. That's actually an accurate historical fact that is anchored down. It is the 6th day of the week that Yeshua dies on the cross, and they take his body down before the Sabbath, and then they rest according to the commandment. Passover was the Thursday night. Friday was the 15th of Nisan. It is the first day of unleavened bread, official technically, and it is the day of the crucifixion. And then Friday night, they before sundown, they take his body down and they put him in the grave, and then they go and rest according to the commandment of the Sabbath. So the day of preparation for the Pascha here, unfortunately, in the NASB is another example of a poor translation. It's the preparation day within the week of Passover. The preparation day of the week of Passover. If you think I'm crazy, let's just look a little more. Let's go to Acts 12, 1 through 5. Now, about that time, Herod the king laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them. And he had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword. When he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. Now it was during the days of unleavened bread. During the days of unleavened bread. What does that mean? That means it's not the first day of unleavened bread or the last day. It's somewhere in the middle, what they call Chol Hamoed is the intermediate days that are bookended by Sabbaths, the first and seventh day. When he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Pascha to bring him out before the people. So Peter was kept in prison, but prayer for him was being made fervently by the church to God. Intending after the Pascha. Well, that doesn't make sense. It's already during the days of unleavened bread that he put him in prison. So why would Luke say intending after the Pascha to bring him out before the people? Is Luke ignorant? Some might accuse that. Some might accuse Luke to be ignorant. I think that would be a very foolish thing. I think we should trust Luke, even from a historical perspective, as a very educated. The Greek is superb Greek, very well educated. And so even an unbeliever would have to, if you're being honest, you're going to respect this as a first century source. Now, for believers, we believe it. So, and I happen to be confident that this is true and accurate. Intending after the Pascha to bring him out before the people. Luke is referring to the whole 7-day festival as Pascha, just as he calls it the days of unleavened bread. He's using this as a variation. It's just a synonym to call Chag HaPesach, just like he did before, and as John did. The feast of the Pascha is the same as the feast of unleavened bread. It's 7 days. Okay, we're going to go now to Josephus, just to show that this is not a ignorant believer in Jesus who's writing this stuff. Look at Josephus. Okay, I've got a few of his sources here. Antiquities of the Jews, book 11. And as the feast of unleavened bread was at hand in the first month, which according to the Macedonians is called Xanthicus, that is the first month, but according to us, Nisan, all the people ran together out of the villages to the city and celebrated the festival, having purified themselves with their wives and children according to the law of their country. And they offered the sacrifice, which was called the Pascha, on the 14th day of the same month, and feasted 7 days, and spared for no cost, but offered whole burnt offerings to God, performed sacrifices of thanksgiving, because God had led them again to the land of their fathers, and to the laws of thereto belonging, and had rendered the mind of the king of Persia favorable to them. So this is Josephus telling the story of the rebuilding of the temple. This is after the return from the Babylonian exile and the feasting here. Feasted 7 days, and it says they performed sacrifices of thanksgiving. This is for 7 days eating food that is not technically the Passover, but it is slaughtered and offered by the priests and the people who bring those what they call zevach shalamim, those Thanksgiving, and these are what they call todah of the Thanksgiving variety. They slaughter them and eat them the same day. Okay, that is going on for 7 days, and it requires a maintenance of purity, because whether you're a priest or if you're the person who's come and offered that, if the priests think that you have become defiled, you're not going to have access to that space until you go through whatever purification is necessary. This is referring to the Pascha as the entire week. Now, there he differentiates the 14th day with the 7 days of feasting of Thanksgiving offerings. However, let's continue to look at other places. The same author, Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, book 14. So Aretas united the forces of the Arabians and of the Jews together and pressed on the siege vigorously. This is just obviously a different historical event that Josephus is recording. As this happened at a time when the Feast of Unleavened Bread was celebrated, which we call the Pascha, the principal men among the Jews left the country and fled into Egypt. But none of the outside bit matters. What matters here is he says this happened at the time when the Feast of Unleavened Bread was celebrated, which we call the Pascha. So clearly, in the Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus, who is a priest himself, he uses the word unleavened bread or Feast of Unleavened Bread and the word the Pascha as synonymous, just like we see in the Apostolic Writings. Let's continue more. Antiquities of the Jews, book 18. As the Jews were celebrating the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which we call the Pascha, it was customary for the priest to open the temple gates just after midnight. So there you go again. In more than one instance, Josephus uses the term Pascha and Chag HaMatzot, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread, synonymously. Jewish War, here's a different book, book 2. And indeed, at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which was now at hand, and is by the Jews called the Pascha, and used to be celebrated with a great number of sacrifices, an innumerable multitude of the people came out of the country to worship. So there you go. Again, Josephus, in several instances, uses Pascha as synonymous with Feast of Unleavened Bread. So Pascha, friends, remember it's an Aramaic term. It's used as a word in different, depending on context. It can refer to the lamb itself. That's where we see the verb where the lamb or where the Pascha is slaughtered, where the Pascha is sacrificed. Then we see it as the meal, where I will eat the Pascha. We see it Chag, the feast of the Pascha, which is a little more broader. It involves going up to Jerusalem. It involves a larger swath of things, all the commandments of having enough people to eat a lamb, for example. It involves understanding of purity. And then we have the Pascha used as the same as unleavened bread, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or the Chag HaMatzot, interchangeably. We see that it hints of it in Exodus, in Ezekiel, throughout the Apostolic Writings, in the Gospel of John, and even in Josephus. And we can look, finally, I didn't prepare the text here, but if you look at Deuteronomy 16, 1 through 3, you will see, it'll say, you'll slaughter the Pesach from the herd or from the flock or from the herd. Bakar is used there. That's from the herd, not the flock. And it says, and you will eat it with matzot, with unleavened bread, for 7 days. You will eat it is referring to the slaughtered animal called the Pesach. Now, we all know that in nuance that properly and technically, the Pesach is limited to that night of the 14th, and everything that remains to morning has to be burnt up, is not consumed. And that the cattle, that is the animals that are slaughtered under what Deuteronomy says, the Pesach, of the 7 days, those animals are also to be eaten. They can be offered as Thanksgiving offerings. So I know that there's a lot of nuance here, but the main point you have to remember is that Pascha can mean a few different things. We have to attend to context, but the Gospel of John and the Synoptics, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are completely coherent in their presentation of the Last Supper being a Passover, and as we see with all these other texts, that we can use the word Pascha to refer to the feast as a whole, the 7 days, without worrying that we're misrepresenting the Torah. So to me, this is an important issue. I have every confidence that the Lord's Supper is indeed, as we saw all the way back to Matthew, if we go all the way back. Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Pascha? That means this meal, the meal in which Judas would betray Yeshua, was in fact a Passover meal. And the Gospel of John assumes that the hearers already know that. I pray that this is a helpful video for you. I know that these issues can be sticky, but it's important to slow down. And we want to leave the baggage that we have in our day and age, in our language, in our preconceptions. And we need to go back and attend carefully to the language as used in the first century and earlier from our sources, and not rely so heavily on translations which might be biased and might not understand these points. And that's my contention here. Pascha is a word that has many uses, but the Pesach dinner, the Pesach Seder, is in fact, the 14th of Nisan at evening is the setting of what we call the Lord's Supper or the Last Supper. Happy Pesach. Shalom.